What if I told you that when empires collapse, it isn't just governments that fall, but entire classes of people who believed they were untouchable? What if the real story of regime change isn't about revolutions or foreign invasions, but about how wealth and privilege quietly dig their own graves? From the Roman senators to the Russian oligarchs, from the French nobility to modern billionaires, the pattern is strikingly consistent. When elites grow too insulated from the systems that sustain them, the empire's fall becomes their own. But how does this happen? How do the richest and most powerful go from shaping history to being erased by it? Let's pull the thread. First, the origins. Every empire begins with a vision, a unifying story that turns chaos into order. In Rome, it was the idea of the Republic, shared civic duty, and the promise that service to the state would be rewarded. In the early days of the United States, it was opportunity, land, liberty, and the chance to build something new. In both, wealth wasn't just tolerated, it was seen as a sign of contribution. The early elites, Roman generals, American industrialists, were often builders. They expanded roads, trade, and influence. But the seed of collapse is planted early. As the wealth of these early elites compounds, power begins to separate from purpose. In Rome, senators began to see their estates as more important than the republic itself. They bought up small farms, replacing citizens with slaves. In 18th century France, the nobles and clergy exempted themselves from taxes, while peasants shouldered the state's debt. In both cases, a system built on cooperation turned into one defined by extraction. Then comes the rise. As the empire's wealth grows, so does inequality. The rich grow richer, but what's more dangerous, they grow detached. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome's elite no longer lived among the people who grew their food or fought their wars. By the 1700s, Versailles became a world unto itself, sealed off from the hunger of Paris. And in the late 20th century, Wall Street became the new Versailles, a realm of abstraction where fortunes were made on screens far removed from the realities of ordinary workers. Each era has its own illusion of permanence. The Roman senators believed their family names would last forever. The French aristocracy thought birthright was divine law. And today, billionaires believe innovation and financial engineering can defy gravity. The empire hums along until it doesn't. The breaking point always begins with a mismatch between perception and reality. Rome's grain imports from Egypt masked the hollowing of its domestic economy. France's royal court mistook credit bubbles for prosperity. In our time, global markets disguise how fragile the real economy can be when concentrated in too few hands. Then something snaps. For Rome, it was the Gracchi brothers, aristocrats who tried to reform land ownership, only to be murdered by their peers. Their deaths marked the end of political compromise and the start of a century of civil wars. In France, it was a financial crisis. The crown's debt spiraled, credit markets froze, and the king's inability to tax the privileged led to collapse. In Russia, it was the failure of the Tsar to modernize fast enough to match industrial powers. Once that moment hits, the elites face a choice: adapt or double down. Almost always, they choose the latter. The Roman Senate refused to limit its estates, clinging to short-term profits. The French nobility resisted reform, convinced the anger of the people could be contained. The Russian aristocracy dismissed Lenin as a fringe radical until it was too late. Each time, the same psychological trap, the belief that control equals safety, but control without legitimacy is a house of glass. Then comes the fallout. When the system breaks, it doesn't just replace rulers, it rewrites the definition of power. The Roman aristocracy lost its land and influence as emperors centralized authority. The French nobles who survived the guillotine found themselves stripped of privilege. The Russian elite fled or were executed, their estates nationalized. In the 20th century, something new emerged. Financial elites learned to adapt faster. After World War II, Western economies created safety valves, taxes, welfare states, and regulated markets to prevent revolt. The wealthy accepted limits because the alternative was chaos. For a few decades, it worked. Inequality shrank. The middle class grew. Social trust recovered. But starting in the 1980s, the cycle reset. Deregulation, globalization, and the rise of technology concentrated wealth at levels not seen since before the Great Depression. The top 1% began capturing nearly all income growth. By 2020, just 8 men owned as much wealth as half the world's population. The empire, this time a globalized financial one, entered its late stage. The signs are all familiar. Political polarization, distrust in institutions, the hollowing of the middle class, the return of populist uprisings. These are not random phenomena. They are the echoes of every collapse before ours. The pattern repeats not because history is predictable, but because human behavior is. When wealth separates too far from work, when privilege stops producing value, the system destabilizes, and when elites use their power to protect themselves from consequences, they accelerate their own demise. Consider this. In the years before Rome's fall, the top 10% controlled nearly all land in Italy. In 1789, France, the nobility and clergy, owned roughly 2/3 of the land, but paid almost no taxes. In pre-revolutionary Russia, 1% of households owned more than 25% of wealth. Today, the top 0.1% of Americans own as much as the bottom 90% combined. Globally, the richest 1% captured nearly 2/3 of all new wealth created since 2020. The math is hauntingly familiar. And here's the paradox. The very forces that make elites rich also make their world fragile. Technological innovation, financial leverage, and global trade create immense wealth, but they also multiply volatility. When crises come, they hit faster, harder, and with less warning. Take 2008. The financial elite who engineered the mortgage boom believed risk was contained. When the system imploded, they were shielded by bailouts, but trust was not. That loss of legitimacy is the modern version of a revolution. Not one of guillotines, but of disillusionment, a slow erosion of faith that the system serves anyone beyond the few. We often imagine regime change as violent, but most collapses begin quietly. Institutions decay before they fall. Laws bend before they break. The ruling class doesn't notice until their power no longer matters. In Rome, it took centuries. In France, decades. In the digital age, it could take years. We're already seeing the warning signs. The rise of alternative currencies and decentralized finance challenging central banks. Political systems gridlocked by distrust, young generations priced out of housing, and skeptical of capitalism itself. These are not isolated trends. They're stress fractures in the same foundation that has cracked throughout history. And yet, the story doesn't have to end the same way. In rare cases, elites have managed to adapt before the breaking point. After the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal saved American capitalism by reforming it. Wealthy industrialists hated it at first, but the alternative, a collapse of the system, was worse. Post-war Germany did something similar, building a social market economy that balanced profit with protection. These were moments when power bent instead of broke. So, where are we now? We stand at a similar crossroads. Wealth inequality has reached levels unseen in a century. The average CEO makes nearly 400 times the salary of the average worker. Housing and education costs outpace income growth. The sense of shared prosperity, the myth that held the empire together, is fading. And yet elites continue to believe that data, policy tweaks, or philanthropy will stabilize things. But history suggests otherwise. Systems don't reform when the ruling class refuses to sacrifice. They reform when survival demands it. Here's the haunting truth. Every fallen elite thought they were indispensable. The Roman Senate thought no empire could function without them. The Bourbons thought divine right made them eternal. The Tsars thought loyalty was unbreakable. Today's billionaires believe technology and capital will keep them insulated, but power without legitimacy always finds its end. The lessons of history don't predict our future, but they warn us about trajectories. So what can we take away? First, concentration creates collapse. When wealth and decision-making concentrate in too few hands, the system loses adaptability. Diversity of power isn't just moral, it's structural stability. Second, legitimacy matters more than control. The moment people stop believing that the system is fair, control becomes impossible to maintain without force or deception, and both erode faster than they seem. Third, reform is cheaper than revolution. Every empire that waited too long to rebalance power paid the price in blood, chaos, or both. The ones that survived changed before they were forced to. It's how fast. Will today's elites learn from history, or like those before them, mistake survival for permanence? The story of regime change isn't just about who rules, it's about who refuses to change until it's too late. And that story is being written right now. If you found this perspective valuable, subscribe and give us a like. It means the world to our small channel. The more we understand these patterns, the better chance we have to break them. Because history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the chorus always begins the same way. Those who think they are safe stop listening. So listen closely before the next fall begins.